Turn the lights down. Get comfortable. You're about to enter the silent war. It's not the kind of war you read about in textbooks. There were no front lines, no parades of tanks crossing borders, no trumpets declaring battle. Instead there were whispers, coded messages, invisible ink, suitcases exchanged in subway stations, a glance, a nod, a life hanging in the balance. The Cold War was not merely a standoff of ideology. It was a global chess match played in the shadows where kings and queens wore grey suits, and pawns sometimes knew too much. It is here, in the long shadows between Washington and Moscow, London and Berlin, Tel Aviv and Havana, that our story begins. After the Second World War had ended, after the bombs had fallen and the smoke cleared, the world did not find peace. It found something more dangerous. It found silence. And in that silence, two superpowers began preparing for a war that would never be declared. The Cold War was a paradox. It was a war that never officially began and never officially ended. It was fought everywhere, from the frozen plains of Siberia to the of Vienna, from the jungles of Central America to the corridors of the White House. It was a war without battles, and yet millions died in its wake. A war where information was more lethal than bullets, and silence more dangerous than a scream. At its heart were spies. Ordinary men and women, teachers, diplomats, students, clerks who led extraordinary double lives. Some believed they were serving their country, some believed they were saving the world, and some just wanted money. This was the battlefield of Espionage, where betrayal was currency and truth was elusive, and behind them all stood powerful, shadowy organizations. The CIA, born from the ashes of World War II, tasked with protecting American interests across the globe. The KGB, ruthless, brilliant, and loyal to the ideology of the Soviet state. MI6, Britain's elite intelligence arm, with a long history and a devastating vulnerability to traitors within. The STASI, East Germany's all-seeing eye, a domestic intelligence machine that turned neighbors into and Mossad, Israel's secret weapons, more agile and capable of feats that stunned the world. These were not just bureaucracies. They were engines of paranoia, institutions built on secrets and sustained by silence. To understand the Cold War is to understand the mind of the spy. It is to understand what it means to trust no one, not your colleague, not your lover, not even your own memory. To wake each morning not knowing if the letter under your door means promotion or execution. To live a life so divided, so fractured, that eventually you forget who you really are. Many of the stories you are about to hear were hidden for decades. Some are still denied. Some come to us only through declassified documents, deathbed confessions, and forgotten tape reels. But they all share a common thread. They shaped the world we live in today, and yet most of us have never heard them. This is the story of the Cold War, told not through speeches and treaties, but through silence, through shadows, and through secrets. Let us go back to the moment when the world changed. Not with an explosion, but with a whisper, to the final days of World War II. It is 1945. Berlin is in ruins. Nazi Germany has fallen, and the uneasy alliance that defeated Hitler, the United States, the Soviet Union, and Britain is fracturing behind closed doors at Yalta and Potsdam. Maps are redrawn, promises are made and broken, and in the cracks between ideologies, suspicion grows. The Soviet Union, led by Joseph Stalin, sees capitalist encirclement at every turn. The United States, under President Truman, fears the spread of communism like a virus. And in Europe, nations that once celebrated liberation now feel the cold grip of Soviet occupation. The Iron Curtain is descending, and with it comes the age of There is a famous quote by George Orwell: "In a time of deceit, Telling the truth is a revolutionary act. During the Cold War, truth was never simple. It was filtered, twisted, disguised. To survive, intelligence agencies had to learn the art of the lie. And so the United States passed the National Security Act in 1947, creating the CIA, a small agency, at first designed to collect information, not wage wars. But soon that would change. Across the world, the Soviet Union reorganized the remnants of the NKVD into the KGB, a vast security service with broad powers, deep reach, and not at all secrecy. It became one of the most feared and formidable organizations in the world, and thus the silent war began. But the first shots had already been fired quietly. In 1945, in the safety of Canada, a Soviet cipher clerk named Igor Guzenko defected, carrying a briefcase full of documents. He exposed a Soviet spy ring operating in the West. The shock was profound. Communist agents, embedded in Allied governments, even in nuclear research. Guzenko's defection marked the beginning, the moment when the Allies realized that yesterday's friend was today's enemy, and so began a new kind of war, not for land, not for flags, but for information. In the years that followed, spy networks would grow like vines twisting through embassies, universities, and defense labs. Every room could be bugged, every phone call recorded, every stranger could be watching. Governments no longer trusted their own staff. Friendships became dangerous. Paranoia became survival. There were no heroes here, only players. Some idealistic, some cynical, some monstrous. You will meet them all. The traitors who thought they were patriots, the patriots who became traitors, the double agents who lived between worlds, and the invisible hands who pulled the strings from the shadows. The world today, our internet, our surveillance states, our global complexes built atop the foundation they laid. They may have operated in the dark, but the consequences of their actions shine on every modern screen. Their stories matter, not just because they are thrilling, but because they remind us how fragile the truth can be when nations are ruled by fear and silence. This is not merely a story about spies, it is a story about us. Our desire to know, our fear of the unknown, our hunger for control and our willingness to destroy for it. And so, with a deep breath and quiet footsteps, we begin. Next, we journey to the earliest years of this shadow war, a world still reeling from global destruction. A time when the first cracks of betrayal began to split old alliances apart. Chapter 1. The birth of a shadow war. From allies to enemies, from comrades to conspirators. The Cold War had begun, and no one was safe. Stay with us. Chapter 1. The birth of a shadow war. From allies to enemies. The year is 1945. The world breathes a fragile sigh of relief. The guns have fallen silent. The cities smolder, bruised and broken. Berlin is a carcass of concrete. Hiroshima, a wound that will never heal. Across Europe and Asia, millions mourn, rebuild, bury. It should be a time for peace. But peace is already slipping through the cracks. Behind the curtains of diplomacy, a colder, quieter conflict is being born. And unlike the world wars before, this one will not be fought in the open. It will unfold behind closed doors, in secret rooms, with whispered names and gloved hands. It will stretch across continents, and it will begin with trust. The cracking of the Grand Alliance. They had stood side by side, Winston Churchill, Franklin D. Roosevelt, and Joseph Stalin united against Hitler, if uneasily, but unity forged in fear does not last long when the fear shifts. At the Yalta Conference in February 1945, The war was nearly over. The leaders met in Crimea, surrounded by the echoes of falling empires. On paper, they spoke of rebuilding, of self-determination, of a Europe that would be free and fair. But in reality, every handshake hid suspicion. Stalin wanted Eastern Europe for the Soviets. Roosevelt wanted a liberal international order. Churchill wanted to keep Britain relevant. Each smiled for the cameras. Each drew red lines behind closed doors. Then came Potsdam, July 1945. Roosevelt was gone dead of a cerebral hemorrhage. Churchill had lost an election and was replaced mid-conference by Clement Attlee. Only Stalin remained unchanged, stern, calculating, unflinching. President Harry Truman, new to the global stage, tried to hold firm. But the tone had shifted. The cracks had widened. Stalin saw weakness. Truman saw menace. The Iron Curtain descends. ... It happened quickly. Poland fell under Soviet control. Then Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, East Germany. Each one absorbed into what Stalin called a buffer zone. Each one losing elections. Freedom, press, each one silenced. Churchill, now out of power, but never out of words, delivered a chilling warning in 1946. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that curtain, the Soviet Union built a world of surveillance, conformity, and fear. In the West, alarm bells rang, but words would not be enough. America strikes back. The CIA is born. Out of this rising dread came a question in Washington. How do you stop an empire that hides its hand? In 1947, Truman signed the National Security Act, creating the Central Intelligence Agency. Its mission: to gather foreign intelligence and protect American interests covertly. But the CIA was not born fully formed. It rose from the wartime OSS, a short-lived but daring agency of spies, saboteurs, and analysts. Where the OSS had dropped agents behind Nazi lines, the CIA would now face a murkier enemy. An ideology, a worldview, a force without clear borders. In Moscow, Stalin did not wait to be challenged. The Soviet NKVD, once the internal arm of Stalin's terror, evolved into the KGB Committee for State Security. A single name, but many faces. Intelligence gathering, counterintelligence, secret police, border patrol, and surveillance. It would become one of the most feared institutions in modern history. And it would strike first, the Gauzenko affair. The first crack. ... Ottawa, Canada, September 5, 1945. A man in a beige coat steps nervously into the night. He carries a briefcase heavy with secrets. His name is Igor Gauzenko. He is a cipher clerk working at the Soviet embassy in Ottawa, and he is about to change the world. For months, Gauzenko has watched the Soviets steal atomic secrets, infiltrate Western governments, operate sleeper agents. He has had enough. He defects. Inside his case are over 100 documents detailing Soviet espionage operations in Canada, the US, and the UK. He offers them to the Canadian government. At first, they don't believe him, but eventually, the truth is undeniable. Communist spies are everywhere. Among them, British physicists Alan Nunn May, feeding atomic secrets to Moscow. Gauzenko's information leads to arrests, trials, headlines. A chill runs down the spines of Western leaders. The war may be over, but infiltration has already begun. This was the first public breach, the first blood in the Cold War espionage war, and the world would never be the same. The Cambridge Five, treason from within. If Gauzenko was the match, The Cambridge Five were the inferno. 5 young men, brilliant, educated, well-dressed. They walked the halls of Cambridge University in the 1930s, dreaming of revolution, disillusioned by capitalism, horrified by fascism. They turned, quietly, to Moscow. Among them, Kim Philby, elegant, cunning, MI6, golden boy, Guy Burgess, flamboyant, reckless, and deeply connected, Donald Maclean, rising star in the British Foreign Office, Anthony Blunt, art historian and spy, later revealed as royal advisor, John Cairncross, quieter, shrouded in ambiguity, recruited by the Soviets in their youth, they climbed the ranks of British intelligence. Philby, in particular, was groomed for greatness, trusted by the CIA, even considered for top roles. All the while, he'd bled secrets to the KGB missions, identities, operations. Lives were lost because of them. In 1951, Burgess and Maclean suddenly vanished, defecting to Moscow. Philby denied everything. He remained in Britain, protected by old friends and a stiff upper lip, until 1963, when the noose finally tightened. He escaped, fled to the USSR, and lived out his days drinking vodka and giving lectures at the KGB. Britain was humiliated, the CIA enraged. The message was clear. Even the highest circles were not safe. The West was bleeding from the inside. Paranoia made policy. Stalin watched all this with satisfaction. He trusted no one, not even his own ministers. His purges had murdered thousands, including many of his spies, yet he believed deeply in the power of spying. To Stalin was not a tool, it was a necessity. His view: the West would always attack. The only question was when, and in Washington, paranoia had found its own champion. The Truman Doctrine, announced in 1947, was clear. It must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. Translation: contain communism. At all costs, the US began funding anti-communist forces in Greece and Turkey. The Marshall Plan pumped billions into rebuilding European effort, as political as it was economic, and beneath the surface, spy games escalated. Scenes from the shadows. A woman walks alone in Berlin. In her purse, a coded mic. She drops a newspaper on a bench. Moments later, a man picks it up and walks away. In New York, a diplomat attends a cocktail party. He laughs, clinks glasses, and slips into the bathroom to photograph a file with a matchbook camera. In Moscow, a Western agent hides a dead drop in the hollow of a tree. Inside, a map, a name, a warning. Every day, hundreds of such moments, unfolded and seen, unknown, unsung. It was a war of subtlety, and it had only just begun. By 1950, the Cold War was no longer theoretical. It was real, it was vast, and it was deadly. The Korean War had erupted. China had gone red. McCarthyism was on the rise in the US, turning suspicion into spectacle. And both sides were accelerating toward a nuclear arms race. But in the background always were the spies, watching, listening, waiting. Some would change history. Others would vanish, forgotten. But all of them would live and die in the shadows. Next, we dive deeper into the fever of the early Cold War, a time when the atom was both power and paranoia, when American secrets were sold for ideology or greed, when the hunt for traitors became a national obsession. Chapter 2: The Atomic Secrets and the Rosenberg Case. ... Espionage goes nuclear, and a family pays the ultimate price. Stay with us. Chapter 2: Berlin, the divided city of spies, Checkpoint Charlie and the Wall of Secrets. The Cold War had many front lines, but none like Berlin, a city torn in two, half in the west, half in the east, half blinking in neon, half staring in silence. After World War II, Berlin became the chessboard of the Cold War, an isolated island of Western presence inside the heart of Soviet-controlled East Germany. For powers shared this fragile space: the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and the Soviet Union. But that unity, like so much in the Cold War, was an illusion. The truth: Berlin was the wound that never healed. And for spies, it was paradise. Berlin, the perfect battlefield. No other city in the world offered what Berlin did in the 1950s and early 60s. 4 intelligence agencies operating in close proximity. A civilian population desperate, divided, and easy to exploit. Checkpoints, shadows, informants, and escape routes. A literal fault line between two worlds. The CIA, MI6, KGB, and STASI turned Berlin into a spy's playground. Dead drops in graveyards, microphones in lamps, bugged typewriters, and double agents selling secrets. Across there were no uniforms here, only overcoats, cigarettes, and cold stares. Every street was watched. Every neighbor could be listening. You could disappear in Berlin, or worse, be seen. Checkpoint Charlie. More than a border, on Friedrichstrasse stood a small white hut. Ordinary, unimpressive, but it became the most iconic checkpoint in the world. Checkpoint Charlie. The crossing between East and West Berlin was more than a border post. It was theater. Tanks stared across the line. Tourists snapped photos. But beneath it all, secrets passed folded in wallets, whispered across fences, traded in fear. It was here that agents defected. It was here that people died trying to cross. And it was here that the Cold War often burned hottest. In silence, Operation Gold, the tunnel to the east, the mole within. George Blake. George Blake was a British intelligence officer. Charming, intelligent, seemingly loyal, but he was also a committed communist and a double agent for the KGB. Before a single shovel touched East German soil, Blake had told Moscow everything about Operation Gold. The KGB decided to let the tunnel operate for nearly a year, feeding it real information, mixed with misdirection. Then, in 1956, they staged a discovery. Soviet troops dramatically found the tunnel, cutting it open for the world to see. The West was humiliated. The East grinned behind closed doors. Years later, when Blake was finally caught in 1961, he was sentenced to 42 years in prison. But even that wasn't the end. In a move straight from fiction, Blake escaped from Wormwood Scrubs prison in London in 1966. And fled to Moscow, where he lived out the rest of his life, unrepentant. Heinz Felf, the spider in the web. If George Blake embarrassed the West, Heinz Felf quietly devastated it. Felf was a former SS officer turned CIA asset, or so they believed. In truth, he was working for the KGB the entire time. The Wall Rises, a city sealed, August 13th, 1961. Berlin awoke to a new reality. Overnight, East German soldiers had begun constructing a wall, barbed wire, concrete blocks, fences cutting through streets, neighborhoods, even homes. The Berlin Wall was more than a physical barrier. It was the Cold War incarnate. Families were divided. Escape attempts were met with bullets. And took a darker turn. The STASI's Germany's secret police became a state within a state. With over 90,000 officers and 180,000 informants, it became the most comprehensive surveillance machine in history. They tapped phones, opened mail, photographed lovers, and turned neighbor against neighbor. Yet, even as the wall rose, so did the resistance. Western agencies found new ways to communicate, smuggle, and spy. Balloon drops, cigarette packs with cars with hidden compartments. The War of Shadows adapted. It always did. Tales from the Frontier. A young American soldier, stationed near Checkpoint Charlie, is offered money and women by a mysterious woman in a Berlin bar. He declines. Days later, she vanishes. She never existed on paper. An East German border guard defects by speeding across the checkpoint in a stolen jeep. Behind him, bullets fly. Ahead, cheers erupt. He lands in Western intelligence custody within minutes. A Western journalist interviews a defector, only to discover weeks later that she was a STASI plant sent to feed disinformation and monitor contacts. In 1962, a CIA agent is captured near Treptow Park. He disappears into an East German prison. In 1965, he is traded back across the wall in exchange for 2 KGB agents held in London. These were not just stories. They were lives, each one shaped by silence, fear, and the thrill of survival. Berlin, the symbol of the Cold War. For nearly 30 years, the Berlin Wall stood as the most visible scar of a divided world. It was a concrete confession. Proof that two ideologies could not coexist. But for spies, it was also opportunity. The tighter the border, the higher the stakes, the more guarded the secrets, the greater the hunger to steal them. Berlin became a metaphor of freedom and oppression, of betrayal and belief. And when the wall finally fell in 1989, it did more than unite a city. It ended an era. But before that day would come, the Cold War still had many chapters to write, and its spies were far from finished. Next, the enemy within espionage in the homeland. From Washington to London, the enemy wasn't always across the border. Sometimes, the greatest threat sat behind the same desk. Moles, traitors, and men who wore two faces. Chapter 3. The enemy among us. Moles, betrayals, and the price of secrets coming up next. Stay in the shadows. Chapter 3. Atomic secrets and the spy rings. Stealing the bomb. The most dangerous secret of the 20th century was light. Light harvested from the atom. Light that could flatten cities. Light that promised to end wars or end the world. In 1945, only one country held that secret. By 1949, there were two. Espionage. While armies marched and diplomats negotiated, a hidden war raged beneath the surface of science and laboratories. A war of quiet hands, whispered promises, and secret loyalties. This is the story of how the Soviet Union stole the bomb, and how a handful of spies reshaped the entire global balance of power. The race for the bomb. In 1939, the US government began quietly assembling a project so massive, so secret, it would change history. The Manhattan Project, a sprawling, multi-billion-dollar effort to build the first atomic bomb driven by urgency, fueled by fear that Nazi Germany was doing the same. By 1945, it succeeded. 2 bombs dropped on Japan. Hundreds of thousands dead. The world, never the same. But even before the mushroom clouds had faded, Soviet eyes were watching, and they weren't far. Operation Enormous, Stalin's secret spy machine. To the Soviets, nuclear parity wasn't just about power. It was survival. Joseph Stalin understood that whoever held the bomb held the world. He launched Operation Enormous, a covert effort to infiltrate the Manhattan Project and steal atomic secrets before the West could solidify its advantage. Unlike other operations, this wasn't a handful of spies. It was a network, a spiderweb of sympathizers, and opportunists placed within the very heart of the US and British scientific elite. At its center was one man, Klaus Fuchs, the perfect traitor. He was brilliant, soft-spoken, unassuming, a German refugee and theoretical physicist. Klaus Fuchs fled Nazi Germany and found sanctuary in Britain. He was grateful, loyal, or so they thought. In reality, Fuchs had become a committed communist. He believed that no single country should monopolize nuclear power, not even the one that gave him a home. While working on the British team at Los Alamos, New Mexico, the beating heart of the Manhattan Project, Fuchs passed detailed information to the Soviets: blueprints, equations, bomb design, theory, all of it. He worked quietly for years, delivering crucial intelligence that allowed Soviet scientists to skip years of development. When the Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb in 1949, the Western world was stunned. The CIA estimated it would take them a decade. It took 4 years. Why? Because they had Fuchs. In 1950, British intelligence finally caught him. He confessed almost immediately, calmly. "I had to help the Soviets," he said. "There was no other way to balance the world." Fuchs was sentenced to 14 years in prison. He served 9. After his release, he moved to East Germany, where he was welcomed as a hero. The Rosenbergs, the only Americans executed for espionage. If Fuchs was the mind, they were the message. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, a working-class couple from New York City, were American communists. Julius had engineering experience. Ethel, a typist, an activist. They were quiet, ordinary, unremarkable. And that's what made them so dangerous. Julius, according to FBI files, recruited others into a Soviet spy ring. He worked through a courier network, collecting bits and pieces from American labs, including atomic information. Ethel's role remains controversial. Did she actively pass secrets, or was she simply aware? In 1950, they were arrested. In 1951, convicted of conspiracy to commit The evidence was murky. Much was based on the testimony of Ethel's brother, David Greenglass, who later admitted he may have lied to protect his own wife. Still, the sentence was death. June 19, 1953. The execution at Sing Prison. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were led separately to the electric chair. They were the only U.S. civilians executed for espionage during the Cold War. The public was divided. Some called them traitors, others martyrs. Protests erupted around the world. Albert Einstein opposed the death sentence. Pope Pius XII appealed for clemency, but President Eisenhower refused to intervene. The night before his execution, Julius wrote, "We are the first victims of American fascism." Ethel kissed her children goodbye and walked, silent, into the chamber. The lights flickered. The room was silent. 2 lives extinguished. A message sent, but the secrets were already gone. The ethics of loyalty versus ideology. Were they traitors? Were they patriots of a different cause? The spies of this era weren't always motivated by greed or fear. Many, like Fuchs or the Rosenbergs, acted from belief, however misguided. They saw capitalism and fascism as threats. They believed in a new world order, one in which no single country could hold ultimate power. Some felt betrayed by the West's hypocrisy, preaching liberty while hoarding destruction. It was not always a question of country ... but of conscience. And that made them unpredictable, unstoppable. The fallout. How espionage changed the world order. The consequences of these leaks cannot be overstated. The Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb on August 29, 1949, years ahead of schedule. The US lost its nuclear monopoly ring. in mutually assured destruction as the basis of peace. NATO and the Warsaw Pact hardened their positions. Paranoia crept into Western democracies. McCarthyism, purges, loyalty oaths. The nuclear arms race began in earnest, leading to hydrogen bombs, intercontinental missiles, and global brinkmanship. Espionage had leveled the playing field, but at what cost? The Cold War, once waged in whispers and diplomacy, was now under the shadow of the mushroom cloud. The spies who helped the Soviets were often cast out by both sides. Klaus Fuchs lived in obscurity. The Rosenberg died in infamy. Other agents anonymous, forgotten, vanished behind iron bars or iron curtains. And yet their legacy endures, not in names, but in consequences. Every treaty, every arms reduction, every red phone installed between Washington and Moscow exists because the world was pulled to the brink by secrets passed in darkness. This was the ultimate paradox. To prevent war, they had to build the capacity to destroy the world. And to balance that power, men and women had to betray the nations they lived in. Next, the mole among us, double lives and deadly lies. As the Cold War progressed, the battlefield shifted again. No longer just East versus West. It became something more intimate, more dangerous. The enemy was now within, inside intelligence agencies, inside homes. Chapter 4. The Mole Hunters, Betrayal Inside the West. The hunt begins, and not everyone survives. Chapter 4. The Mind Games of MK Ultra and Psychological Warfare. The human weapon. They feared the bomb. But what if the greatest weapon wasn't built? What if it was programmed? No smoke, no flash, just a whisper in the mind. By the 1950s, the Cold War was no longer just a war of spies, secrets, and steel. It was becoming a war for the human mind. This was the age of psychological warfare, disinformation, and state-sponsored paranoia, where fear itself became a tool, and where even truth became a casualty. The secret war within. In 1953, the CIA launched one of the most secret and most morally bankrupt operations in its history. Its code name, MKU. Officially, it was a program to study mind control, to understand how behavior could be manipulated, memory erased, and a man turned into a weapon. Unofficially, it was a dive into dark science. With no oversight, no public knowledge, and no consent, the CIA used drugs, hypnosis, sleep deprivation, isolation, and psychological torture in an attempt to unlock the most dangerous weapon of all, the programmable human. The LSD experiments. Central to MK Ultra was a newly discovered chemical, lysergic acid dieth. The CIA believed this psychedelic could be used as a truth serum, a psychological disruptor, even a tool for brainwashing enemy agents. So they tested it. On soldiers, on prisoners, on hospital patients, on sex workers, on students, often without their knowledge. In safe houses, called black sites, the CIA ran experiments through front organizations and paid doctors in white coats. They would lace drinks, inject subjects, and observe what happened. Some people laughed, some panicked, some never recovered. One man was kept on LSD for 174 days straight. Another jumped from a window. Frank Olson. The death that exposed the shadows. Frank Olson was a bacteriologist, an army scientist who worked with the CIA on germ warfare. In 1953, he attended a CIA retreat where his drink was secretly laced with LSD without his knowledge. A week later, Olson was dead. He had jumped or been thrown from a 13th floor hotel window in New York. The CIA claimed it was suicide, that Olson had suffered a breakdown after the drug. But the story didn't add up. His family, in the dark for decades, discovered evidence of blunt force trauma to his head. The body had been moved. There were signs of a later investigations, including the Rockefeller Commission in the 1970s, confirmed that Olson's death was directly tied to but the full truth, still classified, mind control or madness. MKUltra wasn't just immoral. It was messy. Hundreds of sub-projects, no clear goals, often no real science. One CIA official later admitted, "We didn't know what we were doing." The program ran for 2 decades. Then, as the Watergate scandal broke in the 1970s, CIA Director Richard Helms ordered all MKUltra files destroyed. Only a few survived. What they revealed was chilling. Children in Canadian hospitals used as test subjects. Electroshock therapy administered to erase memories. Covert hypnosis programs in prisons. Deep conditioning experiments on unwitting civilians. The line between science fiction and state policy had blurred. The weapon was no longer a bomb. It was the human brain. Propaganda wars. The battle for belief. While the CIA was exploring mind control, the broader Cold War powers were weaponizing information. The logic was simple. If you could shape what people believed, you could shape what they did. Enter the propaganda war. The CIA and Western allies launched massive media efforts to beam pro-democracy. Radio Free Europe and Voice of America became household names in Eastern Europe broadcasting music, news, and counter-propaganda across barbed borders. Polish workers heard about Western wages. Czech students heard Beatles songs and protest anthems. East Germans heard the truth about the Berlin Wall. The Soviets retaliated with active measures, a blend of fake news, forged documents, and planted stories. They spread rumors of US bioweapons in Korea. They claimed AIDS was an American invention. They infiltrated peace movements in the West-Dessau division. This wasn't it was perception, warfare, the theater of control. Both sides understood something profound. What people believe can be more powerful than what is true, so they manipulated reality. In the West, Red Scares and McCarthyism turned neighbors into enemies. In the East, state truth was law regardless of facts. News was weaponized. Art, film, literature all became tools of influence. And behind the curtain, the puppet masters were intelligence agencies. They didn't just want your secrets. They wanted your mind. The legacy of MK-Ultra. MK-Ultra was officially shut down in the 1970s. The CIA never fully apologized. In 1995, President Clinton issued a public statement acknowledging the program, saying, "What was done should never happen again. We must never allow our government to strip individuals of their dignity and humanity." But for many, the damage was done. Survivors few, and scattered suffered lifelong trauma. Others died without ever knowing what had been done to them. And still, the spectre lingers. In modern conspiracy theories, in pop culture, in the whispered suggestion that somewhere, someone is still pulling mental strings. Was MK-Ultra a failure or a quiet success buried under disinformation? We may never know. But one thing is certain. The Cold War wasn't just fought with guns and spies. It was fought in the brain. Next, the Mole Hunters. Betrayal inside the West. Philby, Ames, Hansen held the right clearances and smiled as they sold secrets to the other side. In the coming chapter, we step into the most dangerous territory of all, when the enemy is sitting at your desk. Chapter 5. The Cuban Chessboard, Fidel, the CIA, and the Bay of Pigs, Cuba, Just 90 miles from the coast of Florida, a small island caught between two giants. But in the Cold War, Size meant nothing. What mattered was position. Cuba became a pawn, a bishop, and eventually the queen in a game of global nuclear chess. And the players, presidents, revolutionaries, spies, and assassins. This chapter is not just about one failed invasion or one missile standoff. It's about how the world spun to the edge of annihilation because of secrets, lies, and cigars that could explode. The revolution that lit the match. In 1959, Fidel Castro overthrew the US-backed dictator Fulgencio Batista and came to power in Cuba. At first, Washington wasn't sure what to make of him. Castro spoke of reform and nationalism, but quickly it became clear he was aligning with Moscow. Land reforms, nationalization of American companies, and fiery anti-US speeches confirmed it. Cuba had gone red. For the United States, this wasn't just a political shift. It was an existential crisis. A Soviet ally, armed and hostile, less than 100 miles from Miami. It had to be stopped. The Bay of Pigs. A blueprint for disaster. By 1961, the CIA had a plan, under President Eisenhower, and later approved by John F. Kennedy. The agency trained over 1,400 Cuban exiles, former soldiers, students, and dissidents at secret camps in Guatemala and Nicaragua. Their mission: invade Cuba, spark an uprising, overthrow Castro. They called it Operation Zapata. History remembers it as the Bay of Pigs invasion. On April 17, 1961, the exiles landed on Playa, but the CIA had wildly overestimated popular support for the invasion. Cuban forces, bolstered by Soviet advisors and backed by Castro's fiery charisma, crushed the attackers in 72 hours. The world watched in disbelief as US planes were shot down. Prisoners were paraded on TV. Castro emerged stronger than ever. Kennedy, just 3 months into his presidency, took full responsibility. But behind the scenes, the blame was already being whispered. Bad intelligence, overconfidence, arrogance. The CIA had stumbled, and the Cold War had just entered a dangerous new phase. Castro's spies in Miami. Fidel Castro wasn't just a fiery speaker or a military tactician. He was also a master of counterintelligence. In the wake of the Bay of Pigs, the Cuban State Security Agency, Dirección General de Inteligencia, began planting deep cover agents in the US, especially in Miami, the exile capital. These agents infiltrated exile groups, tracked assassination attempts, and fed disinformation back to the CIA. Some even worked directly with American intelligence. Handlers, double agents from the start. It is estimated that up to 90% of exile operatives sent into Cuba by the CIA were captured or turned. The island became a fortress of deception. The US was now fighting a shadow war against shadows it couldn't see. 13 days to the end of the world. October 1962. A U-2 spy plane flying over Cuba snaps a photo. What it reveals shakes the Pentagon. Soviet missile sites under construction. Nuclear, capable of reaching every major American city in minutes. The Cuban Missile Crisis had begun. For 13 days, the world held its breath. Kennedy demanded removal. Khrushchev refused. The CIA played a crucial role analyzing aerial photos, monitoring Soviet movements, and intercepting communications. The White House created Crisis Committee. Behind its closed doors, generals urged airstrikes. Some wanted invasion, but Kennedy, armed with the CIA's intelligence, chose a naval blockade instead. The Soviet ships slowed. Tensions rose, and finally, through a back-channel agreement, the Soviets withdrew their missiles. In secret, The US also agreed to remove its missiles from Turkey. Nuclear war was narrowly avoided. But trust was shattered, and espionage, not armies, had kept the apocalypse at bay. The bizarre war on Castro. The CIA couldn't let Cuba go, and they couldn't get over Fidel. So they tried something else. They tried to kill him again and again. Over 600 plots were conceived, some so absurd they felt like comic books. Exploding cigars laced with high explosives, poisoned diving suits infected with bacteria, a beauty queen lover with a syringe in her handbag, depilatory chemicals to make Castro's beard fall out and humiliate him, even a plan to dose his radio studio with LSD, making him sound insane on air. One operation, M-Lash, involved a Cuban official working with the CIA who was handed a pen rigged with a hidden hypodermic needle. None of them worked. Fidel survived, and often he laughed. Later, when asked about the CIA's assassination attempts, Castro smirked. If surviving assassination attempts were an Olympic event, I would win the gold medal. Lessons from the island. The Cuban chapter of the Cold War teaches us something vital. Espionage is not always about precision. Sometimes it's about chaos. The CIA's obsession with Cuba revealed its limits, its strengths, and its arrogance. Cuba, small and defiant, proved that the Cold War wasn't just about size or power, it was about who could outwit the other. And in Fidel Castro, the CIA met its match. Next, the mole hunters. When loyalty died in the West. From Kim Philby to Aldrich Ames, the next chapter dives deep into betrayal. When Western intelligence was poisoned from the inside, and the cost was counted in agents lost, secrets leaked, and entire networks burned to the ground. Chapter 6. Double agents and the mole hunters. Who do you trust? There is a saying in intelligence circles. The most dangerous enemy is the one who shakes your hand. In a world built on secrets, betrayal isn't just possible, it's inevitable. But what happens when the betrayal comes from within, from the very heart of the agencies sworn to protect their nations? This is the story of double agents, of men who smiled at their colleagues while silently destroying them, of lives ruined, networks burned, and paranoia that spread like wildfire. This is the story of the moles, and the desperate hunt to find them. The life and lies of Aldrich Ames, the CIA's most damaging traitor. He wore cheap suits, drove a battered Jaguar, was often drunk at lunch, and yet Aldrich Ames was one of the CIA's most trusted officers. Assigned to the Soviet division in Langley, Ames had access to the crown jewels, the identities of US assets inside the USSR. Deep in debt and disillusioned, he walked into the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C. and offered everything for money. $50,000 to start, then more, much more. By the time he was caught, Ames had received over $2.5 million from the KGB. He used it to pay off debts, buy a Jaguar, and move into a lavish home with his second wife. But the real cost wasn't financial. Within months of his betrayal, at least 10 CIA assets inside the USSR were arrested. Many were executed. Others simply disappeared. At first, Langley suspected a breach in communication channels, then sloppy, but the pattern was too clean, too surgical. A mole had to be in the heart of operations, and yet it took nearly 9 years to find him. Why? Because Ames had learned the golden rule of betrayal. Be boring. Be invisible. Don't give them a reason to look at you. Robert Hansen, the phantom within the FBI. If Ames was reckless, Robert Hansen was an FBI agent in the Soviet Counterintelligence Division. Hansen betrayed the United States for over 2 decades, in complete silence. He didn't walk into embassies. He never met his Russian handlers. Instead, he used dead drops leaving classified documents under bridges or behind park signs. In return, he received over $1.4 million in cash and diamonds. Hansen was a devout Catholic, a father of 6, and a man obsessed with secret. He betrayed his country not just for money, but for power. The power of knowing things no one else knew, of controlling a game only he understood. What did he give up? The identity of every US double agent in Russia, top-secret operations, surveillance techniques, the entire US nuclear war continuity plan. He even outed a Soviet general working for the CIA, who was then executed. And yet, like Ames, Hansen was hiding in plain sight. He was caught in 2001, only because the FBI bought a file from a Russian defector for $7 million containing a fingerprint and voice recording that led straight to him. His reaction when arrested. "What took you so long, Kim Philby? The British betrayal. But to understand betrayal at the deepest level, you have to go back to Cambridge. To a time when idealism turned deadly. Harold Kim Philby was charming, well-educated, and deeply embedded in British intelligence. He rose through the ranks of MI6, even becoming chief liaison to the CIA. But Philby had been working for the Soviets since the 1930s. Along with fellow Cambridge students Donald Maclean, Guy Burgess, Anthony Blunt, and John Cairncross, he formed the infamous Cambridge 5 young men who believed in Marxism and betrayed their country for ideology. Philby wasn't just a spy, he was a black hole of secrets. He leaked operations, burned networks, cost countless lives. When suspicion grew, he skillfully talked his way out. Even wrote newspaper columns denying the allegations. But when Maclean and Burgess defected to Moscow in 1951, the net began to tighten. In 1963, Philby vanished from Beirut. He reappeared in Moscow. There, he was hailed as a hero, given medals, a dacha, a pension, but he died a broken man, lonely, alcoholic, cut off from the England he once knew. Philby's betrayal wasn't about money or power, it was ideological, and that made it even more dangerous. Paranoia at Langley and beyond. The revelations of Ames, Hansen, and Philby sent shockwaves through intelligence communities worldwide. Suddenly, every colleague was suspect. Every failed operation, every leak, every missing acetol could be the result of another mole. The CIA and FBI launched internal purges, polygraph tests, surveillance, backroom interrogations. Some promising careers were destroyed over rumors. And yet, the fear was justified, because the damage wasn't just operational, it was psychological. How do you protect a secret agency when the danger is inside the room? Tradecraft and the cost of being wrong. Tradecraft, the dark art of espionage, was forged in this paranoia. Moles learn to use. Brush passers. Short, unnoticed handoffs of materials. Dead drops. Hidden caches left in public places. One-time pads. Unbreakable encryption tools. False flag meetings. Pretending to be someone you're not, to recruit someone who thinks they're someone else. But even with perfect tradecraft, all it took was one mistake. One casual conversation, one tail not spotted, one intercepted message, and everything burned. Lives lost, assets arrested, diplomatic disasters triggered. In the end, espionage isn't about glamour, it's about risk and trust. Trust is just a temporary illusion, a tool, a liability. Closing thought. Double agents remind us that in the Cold War, loyalty wasn't binary. It was layered, conflicted, and often for sale. There were patriots to one side, traitors to another, Heroes in one country, monsters in the other, but above all they were the most dangerous kind of spy. The kind who knew exactly how you worked, because they sat beside you every single day. Next, spy games in the Middle East, Mossad, assassinations, and deception. The desert wasn't silent. In the next chapter, the Cold War unfolds in the Middle East, where Israel's Arab intelligence services and global superpowers played a deadly game of shadows, sabotage, and survival. This version removes single-sentence paragraphs and consolidates related ideas while preserving the original structure and content. Let me know if you need further adjustments. Chapter 7. The STASI, East Germany's all-seeing eye, a nation of informants. In George Orwell's 1984, Big Brother watched you from screens, from walls, from your own mind. But in East Germany, the STASI didn't need fiction. They made it real. From the ashes of World War II, the German Democratic Republic rose, backed by the Soviet Union and haunted by paranoia. At its cold heart stood one of the most feared intelligence agencies in history, the Ministry for State Security. Die Stotterkurt, the STASI. It wasn't just an agency. It was a system, a machine, a nationwide net of surveillance, betrayal, and fear. The terror of total surveillance. The STASI didn't merely spy on enemies. It spied on everyone, every citizen, every whisper, every joke told in poor taste, every letter opened, every phone tapped. They bugged apartments with hidden microphones, drilled into ceilings and walls. They planted informants in offices, schools, churches, theaters, and hospitals. They even had agents stationed inside West Germany, posing as loyalists who fed back information to the By the 1980s, the STASI employed over 90,000 full-time officers and nearly 200,000 unofficial informants, known as armies. To put it in perspective, in Nazi Germany, the Gestapo had one agent for every 2,000 citizens. In East Germany, the STASI had one informer for every 6.5 people. Your neighbor could be an informer, your wife, your child, even your pastor, and worse, you might be one without fully realizing it. The files of a nation, the STASI documented everything. Meticulously, obsessively, endlessly. They filled miles of shelves with files, over 111 kilometers of paper records, and more than 39 million index cards, each one detailing phone calls made, conversations overheard, movements tracked, items bought, friends met, books read, and dreams shattered. They stored odor samples from suspect small cloths, rubbed on skin and sealed in jars to train dogs to track individuals by scent. They filmed people in parks, monitored children's drawings for signs of antisocial behavior, and watched for nonconformist hairstyles and Western music tastes. This wasn't surveillance for security. It was surveillance for obedience, for psychological control, because once you believe someone's watching you, you start watching yourself. Love, betrayal, and the bedroom listener. Among the most devastating consequences of the STASI's reach were the personal betrayals. Husbands turned on wives, wives turned on husbands. In one notorious case, a woman discovered decades later that her partner of 7 years had been reporting on her the entire time. He filed weekly reports on her moods, conversations, suspicions, even her intimate dreams. When she confronted him after the wall fell, he showed no remorse. "You were drifting," he told her. "I thought I could help." Even children were groomed to report on their parents in school. Teachers encouraged students to confess family conversations. Some were rewarded, others simply didn't understand the consequences, and it was too late. The tools before the digital age Long before facial recognition, drones, and digital spyware, the STASI pioneered manual surveillance on an industrial scale. They used miniature cameras hidden in purses, pens, and buttons, wiretapped telephone lines connected directly to agency headquarters, steam rooms to open and reseal mail without leaving a trace, and copy machines that secretly recorded every document printed. They even trained agents in handwriting replication to forge letters and create false trails. The STASI also deployed psychological warfare, a program called Zersetzung, meaning decomposition. Rather than arrest a dissident, they would sabotage their job, interfere with their marriage, plant false rumors, send anonymous threats, or move furniture in their apartment to convince them they were losing their mind. It wasn't about eliminating enemies. It was about erasing resistance through silence, shame, and madness, resistance and defection. Despite the fear, resistance flickered quietly, courageously. Artists, writers, pastors, and students began organizing underground meetings, smuggling banned literature, and recording Western music on cassette tapes passed hand. Many paid the price. Arrest, imprisonment, torture. Some chose to flee. Over 5,000 people successfully escaped over, under, or through the Berlin Wall, but more than 130 died trying. One of the most daring escapes was that of Werner Stiller, a STASI officer who defected to the West in 1979 with valuable intelligence. He crossed into the West, hidden in the trunk of a car, carrying microfilm documents that exposed dozens of STASI operations. His defection sent shockwaves through the agency. They never forgave him. They called him a traitor, but to the West, he was a hero. The fall of the STASI. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, the people stormed the STASI headquarters in Normanenstraße, Berlin. They found rooms full of shredded files, agents desperately trying to destroy evidence. But they were too late. Activists spent years painstakingly reconstructing torn documents like historical jigsaw puzzles, rebuilding the truth. To this day, millions of East Germans have filed requests to view their own STASI files. Some discover lovers who betrayed them, friends who weren't friends, and truths they wish had stayed buried. The STASI archive now stands as a monument to memory, transparency, and a warning that absolute surveillance is not strength. It is weakness born of fear. Closing thought. The STASI tried to control a nation by controlling its conscience. They failed, but their legacy remains a chilling reminder of how far a state can go to maintain control, not through force, but through the quiet weaponization of trust. Because the most devastating betrayal, isn't from a stranger in the shadows, it's from the person lying next to you. Next. Chapter 8. Spy Games in the Middle East, Mossad assassinations, and deception. From the deserts of Sinai to the streets of Paris, the Cold War's hidden war flared in a new arena where Mossad's legendary precision, Arab resistance, and global politics collided in deadly silence. Chapter 8. The Middle East, Spy Wars, Mossad, Arab intelligence, and the Shadow War. In the sun-baked deserts and bustling cities of the Middle East, a shadow war unfolded just as fierce, just as secretive as anywhere else during the Cold War. Here, beneath ancient sands and holy places, a new generation of spies carved their legacies. This was a battlefield where borders blurred, loyalties shifted, and the stakes were nothing less than survival. The rise of Mossad, from humble beginnings to global reach, founded in 1949, just a year after the establishment of Israel. Mossad emerged from the ashes of war with one clear purpose: to safeguard the fragile new state by any means necessary. Unlike the sprawling intelligence behemoths of the superpowers, Mossad was small, agile, and ruthless, built On a foundation of secrecy and innovation, it recruited from all corners: Holocaust survivors, soldiers, academics, spies from Europe, and native-born Israelis. With the fierce determination to protect their homeland, Mossad quickly made its mark, not just gathering intelligence, but launching covert operations far beyond Israel's borders. Operation Wrath of God. The hunt for Munich's shadows. The world's attention turned sharply to Mossad in 1972, after a brutal attack that shocked the globe. During the Munich Summer Olympics, a Palestinian militant group called Black September took Israeli athletes hostage, resulting in the death of 11 Israelis. The world watched helplessly. But Israel's response was swift, secret, and deadly. Operation Wrath of God was launched, a covert campaign to track down and eliminate those responsible. Agents scoured Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East, employing assassination, sabotage, and espionage in a relentless pursuit of justice. Targets were found in Paris, Rome, Beirut, and beyond. Cars exploded in dark streets, shots rang out in crowded cafes. False identities and forged passports became everyday tools. The operation blurred the lines between justice and revenge, morality and necessity. Arab intelligence agencies, shadows in the desert opposing Mossad, were intelligence agencies from Egypt, Syria, and Jordan, each shaped by their own histories and ambitions. Egypt's Mukhabarat, led by formidable figures like General Atef Sidki, grew from a domestic security service into a regional player, often collaborating with the Soviet Union for training and technology. Syria's Mukhabarat, infamous for brutality, used widespread surveillance and torture to suppress dissent while engaging in covert ops across Lebanon and Israel. Jordan's General Intelligence Directorate, more moderate but fiercely loyal to the Hashemite monarchy, balanced espionage with diplomacy in a complex regional chess game. These agencies didn't just spy on Israel, they spied on each other. Alliances were fragile. Friendships were temporary. Double crosses were routine. Espionage in war. The Six-Day and Yom Kippur conflicts, the Six-Day War of 1967, shattered the status quo. Surprise Israeli airstrikes decimated Arab air forces within hours, but behind the scenes, intelligence was king. Mossad intercepted critical communications. Egyptian and Syrian spies struggled to conceal their true plans. The Arab defeat was not just on battlefields, it was in their inability to shield secrets. 2 years later, in 1973, during the Yom Kippur War, the tables turned. Egyptian and Syrian forces launched a surprise attack on Israel during one of the holiest days on the Jewish calendar. The shock was devastating. Intelligence failures haunted Israeli leadership. But it was espionage that helped save the day. Mossad's agents and electronic surveillance uncovered crucial movements, enabling. Meanwhile, Arab intelligence, backed by Soviet advisors, executed deceptive measures that initially confounded Israeli responses. Realpolitik and the web of alliances. The Middle East's Cold War was not just about ideology, it was about survival and power. Both superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, used the region as a proxy battleground, supplying weapons, advisors, and intelligence. Yet within this, local players operated with fierce independence. Mossad sometimes collaborated with Western agencies, sharing intelligence on Soviet arms shipments. At other times, they clashed or withheld information. Arab intelligence services found themselves at times allied, other times rivals, each pursuing their own national interests. Double agents operated with impunity. One famous example was Ali Hassan Salameh, a Palestinian militant who doubled as a Jordanian intelligence asset. His death in 1979 by a Mossad car bomb in Beirut symbolize the tangled loyalties and brutal realities of the legacy of the Middle East spy wars. The Cold War espionage in the Middle East was more than secret meetings and stolen documents. It shaped the fate of nations, sparked wars, and forged an intelligence culture that persists today. Mossad became synonymous with cunning and ruthlessness. Arab intelligence agencies learned to adapt and survive amid chaos. Yet beneath the spy craft and shadows, ordinary people bore the consequences. Families torn apart, lives upended by suspicion. In the desert's heat and the city's shadows, espionage was not just a tool, it was a way of life. Next, Chapter 9. Cyber Shadows. The dawn of digital espionage. As the Cold War waned, a new frontier emerged, one not fought with guns or dead drops, but with code, algorithms, and invisible networks. The silent war didn't end. It evolved. Chapter 9. The Afghan Trap. Spying in the graveyard of empires. The CIA, the Mujahideen and the Red Army, the rugged mountains of Afghanistan, harsh, unforgiving, and ancient, have long been called the graveyard of empires, a place where mighty powers have stumbled, bogged down in endless conflict. During the Cold War, this remote land became the stage for one of the most complex and secretive espionage operations ever undertaken, a clandestine war of shadows, deception, and unintended consequences. Operation Cyclone. The billion-dollar gamble in 1979. The Soviet Union sent tens of thousands of troops into Afghanistan to prop up a fragile communist government. This intervention sent shockwaves through the West. For the United States, it was a direct chance to bleed the Soviet bear in a prolonged, brutal conflict without firing a conventional shot. The CIA's Operation Cyclone began as one of the longest and most expensive covert operations in its history. For nearly a decade, billions of dollars, tons of weapons, and secret support flowed through the veins of Afghan resistance. Fighters, arms, money, and ideology. The CIA funneled sophisticated weaponry, Stinger missiles that could shoot down Soviet helicopters, explosives, and training. Money was sent in cachefong, bundled in suitcase, through a labyrinth of proxies and intermediaries. But this wasn't simply a game of dollars and guns. It was a war of ideas. Communism versus Islamism. East versus West. Secular regimes against tribal loyalties. The CIA and its allies nurtured these insurgents as freedom fighters, champions of resistance. But beneath the surface, alliances were fragile, shifting, and sometimes dangerous. The role of Pakistan's ISI, the Pakistani intelligence service ISI, became a vital and complicated player. Pakistan's military rulers saw the Afghan conflict as a way to secure their own interests, to create a friendly buffer state and counter Indian influence. The IIZ managed the flow of arms and funds from the CIA to the Mujahideen, but also pursued its own agendas, favoring certain factions over others, often those aligned with Islamist ideologies. The IRZ shaped the battlefield far beyond what Washington intended. This covert partnership created an intricate web of loyalties, rivalries, and betrayals. Blowback. The unintended consequences. The Afghan war was a double-edged sword. The CIA had succeeded in turning the Soviets into a costly quagmire, hastening the collapse of the Soviet Union. But in the process, they helped foster militant networks that would later become a new global threat. Many of the Mujahideen, trained and armed by the West, evolved into factions like the Taliban and extremist groups, including Al-Qaeda. Figures like Osama bin Laden cut their teeth during this proxy war. The very tactics of espionage, funding, and covert support that won battles in the 1980s planted seeds of terror that would bloom decades later. Espionage's role in modern terrorism, the Afghan trap, revealed the deep complexities of intelligence work. It showed how spies and secret agents could change the course of history, but also how their actions could spiral beyond control. Electronic intercepts, human intelligence, and undercover operations all played a role in tracking insurgent movements. Yet, the fog of war, combined with the ideological fervor of local fighters, made the battlefield unpredictable. The intelligence community wrestled with this new reality, the blurred line between ally and enemy, freedom fighter and terrorist. Reflections on the Afghan shadow war. As the Soviet Union withdrew in 1989, the CIA quietly ended Operation Cyclone. But the echoes of that secret war resonate today. Afghanistan remains a symbol of Cold War, espionage, paradox, a place where great power, ambition met ancient tribal realities, where covert victories had costly and unforeseen consequences. The Afghan trap was a lesson in hubris, complexity, and the shadows that linger long after the guns fall silent. Next. Chapter 10, Endgame. The fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the spy empires, the final unraveling of the Cold War's secret world the spies left behind, the revelations and the legacy that still shapes global intelligence today. Chapter 10. The fall of the KGB and the Endgame, the collapse of the Invisible Empire. The Cold War had dragged on for nearly half a century, a slow-burning contest of wills, secrets, and shadows. But as the 1980s drew to a close, the seemingly indestructible world of espionage began to tremble. Cracks appearing in the vast machinery of the Soviet intelligence empire, Perestroika and Glasnost. Winds of change. By the mid-1980s, Mikhail Gorbachev emerged with new policies. Perestroika and these reforms aimed to revive a faltering Soviet economy and open the government to public scrutiny, an unimaginable shift from decades of secrecy and repression. For the KGB, the Soviet Union's formidable intelligence and security agency, these reforms were a threat. The walls of secrecy that had protected their operations were suddenly being chipped away. No longer was silence golden, it became a liability. The failed coup against Gorbachev in August 1991, conservative hardliners within the KGB and the Communist Party attempted a coup to overthrow Gorbachev and roll back reforms. For 3 tense days, the world watched as tanks rolled through Moscow, the air thick with uncertainty. The coup failed, largely due to popular resistance and the defiance of leaders like Boris Yeltsin. The coup exposed deep divisions within the Soviet elite and fatally weakened the KGB's grip. The KGB's collapse and Putin's rise, with the Soviet Union dissolving in December 1991. The KGB was dismantled, its vast intelligence network fragmented. Many agents found themselves without purpose. Their empire vanished overnight. One former KGB officer, however, would rise from the ruins. Vladimir Putin. Starting his post-intelligence career in St. Petersburg politics, Putin's ascent to the Russian presidency was shaped by his KGB background. He embodied the shadow world that had defined the Cold War, quiet, calculating, and ever-present. Spies with no cause. What happened to the Cold Warriors? The end of the Cold War left countless spies adrift. Some turned their talents to private security, consulting, or writing memoirs. Others struggled with identities. Betrayals and defections continued. But the high-stakes chessboard had changed. New enemies would emerge. But the clarity of the Cold War's us versus them was gone. Unraveling archives. Learning the truth, post-1991, as the Soviet Union vanished, millions of pages of classified documents became accessible. Historians and intelligence experts began piecing together the hidden stories behind decades of revelations about moles, covert operations, and dark deeds shocked the world. The truth was messy. Heroes and villains blurred. Moral lines faded. But these archives allowed the world to finally understand the scale and human cost of the Invisible War. Reflections on the end of an era. The collapse of the KGB marked not just the fall of a spy agency, but the end of a global era. The Invisible War that had shaped politics, societies, and countless lives entered history's shadowy archives. Yet, the legacy of Cold War espionage lingers in the institutions, in the leaders, and in the secret battles that continue in new forms. The silent war was over, but its echoes will never fully fade. Conclusion: legacy of the Cold War espionage wars. The Cold War's secret battles shaped the modern world in ways few fully grasp. From shadowy meetings in Berlin to secret labs in Afghanistan, the spies of this era danced a dangerous dance world, where loyalty was a currency, betrayal a constant threat, and information the deadliest weapon. Today, as new conflicts arise, the lessons of this invisible war remind us. Truth, secrecy, and power remain locked in eternal tension, waiting in the shadows. Conclusion: shadows that still move. What did we learn? As the dust settles on decades of Cold War espionage, we are left to reflect on a world forever shaped by shadows and secrets. The silent war of spies, double agents, and hidden agendas did more than just define a historic rivalry. It transformed how nations gather intelligence, wage conflict, and understand trust. Espionage was the invisible thread weaving through the fabric of global politics. It forced governments to innovate, to anticipate, and often to betray. It created heroes in the dark and villains in the light. Most of all, it demonstrated the profound power and danger of knowledge itself, the birth of modern intelligence. The Cold War gave rise to many of the intelligence agencies we know today, agencies that still operate behind closed doors, with methods and legacies forged in that intense struggle. The CIA, KGB, MI6, Mossad, and others evolved in response to the unique challenges of a bipolar world. Their stories reveal that intelligence is never just about gathering facts. It is a battle of perception, deception, and psychological warfare. The lessons learned during that era continue to influence how states conduct espionage in the 21st century, in cyberspace and beyond. Behind every cryptic message and covert operation, there were lives often broken or lost in service of shadowy causes. Spies who betrayed friends and families, operatives who disappeared into black sites, and ordinary citizens caught in webs of suspicion. Trust became the rarest commodity. Paranoia seeped into governments and societies alike, and sometimes the cost was innocent lives sacrificed at the altar of ideology. This human toll reminds us that espionage is not just an abstract game of chess. It is a story of real people, with hopes, fears, and mistakes. Are we still in a Cold War, just digital now? Today, the Cold War might seem like a distant chapter in history, but in many ways, its echoes resonate louder than ever. Cyber espionage, information warfare, and global surveillance have replaced trench coats and dead drops. The battlefield is now virtual, yet the stakes remain just as high: national security, political influence, and public trust. The question lingers: are we merely in a new phase of the Cold War, where shadows move through data streams instead of alleys? Understanding the past gives us tools to navigate the uncertain present. Why these stories still matter? The stories of Cold War espionage are more than thrilling tales of spies and secrets. They are a mirror reflecting humanity's deepest struggles between power and principle, loyalty and betrayal, fear and hope. They teach us about the fragility of peace and the complexity of truth. They invite us to ask difficult questions. How much secrecy can a society bear? When does protection become oppression? And what price are we willing to pay for security? So now, as we close the cover on this long-shadowed chapter of history, let us sit quietly with these questions. Dim the lights again. Feel the weight of silence after a lifetime of whispered secrets. Know that in the stillness, the ghosts of spies and statesmen linger not as villains or heroes, but as echoes of a world that was, and perhaps still is, shaped by shadows, and perhaps, in understanding their stories, we glimpse a little more clearly the nature of trust and the human cost of its absence. Thank you for journeying through the hidden corridors of history. May these tales of shadow and light stay with you as reminders of a world where silence spoke volumes,